Hello and welcome to episode 84 of a Plain Accounts podcast series, where every week we get together and discuss the upcoming gospel election that our pastors will be preaching in our churches this coming Sunday. Today we will be discussing Mark 13:24 through 37, and our wrote on the commentary for this week's passage is Jim Waters. Jim, it's so good to have you with us today on our podcast. Would you introduce yourself a bit to our audience?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. I was telling Ben before this came on that he's making my dream come true because I love podcasts, and this is the first podcast I've ever been invited to be on. So I'm excited to be here. Thanks for listening. I most recently graduated from Vanderbilt Divinity School in May with a Master of Theological Studies degree. And at this point, I am working at Vanderbilt doing academic event planning and applying for PhD programs. So, yeah.
Is there any programs on the top of your list?
So Vanderbilt would be great. So my work usually focuses on like the intersection of social movements and religion and theology.
Oh, wow.
So that's really where I find that theology comes alive the most for me personally. At least that's where I can observe it most easily. And so, yeah, Vanderbilt would be perfect. Emory's up there. I'm applying to Duke. I'm applying to UVA and FSU, actually, because they put out the Journal of Religious Ethics. So,
Wow, that's incredible. Well, our prayers will be with you for that. That's exciting to see what's going to come in your future for that. That's great.
thank you.
Yeah, thanks again for joining us today. We look forward to discussing this text. But before we jump into our conversation, I wanted to cover just a housekeeping issue. We are excited to say that A Plain Account is moving, sort of. We're moving from a Wix-based platform to a WordPress, which will dramatically increase the user experience. So we're really excited about that. For those of you who are interested, we're changing hosts, and we will have more control over the site than we currently do, and it'll create more of a fluid site, and we'll be able to add some more functionality to the website and things like that. So keep an eye on that. We have been listening to your feedback and critiques over the site. We just really want to make a better user experience, and we're hoping to add more of a liturgics-based page, so we can talk about the way that our sanctuaries look in concordance with where we're going in the church season. So keep an eye out for those things. You also have an opportunity to donate. We're doing a fundraising drive through the season of Advent. So keep an eye on there. We'd love to have you contribute in any way you can. So we're hoping to make it a more versatile site for you in the future. Well, let's jump into Mark. We're going to be reading from chapter 13, 24 through 37. A lot of really bright, fluffy, cozy things that Jesus says in this passage as we start our walk towards Christmas. So let's read what Jesus has to say to Mark's audience today. Mark chapter 13, verses 24 through 37, and I'm reading from the NIV version. But in those days following that distress, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. At that time, people will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. And he will send his angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of the heavens. Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see these things happening, you know that it is near, right at the door. Truly, I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. But about that day or hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Be on guard, be alert. You do not know when that time will come. It's like a man going away. He leaves his house and puts his servants in charge, each with their assigned task, and tells the one at the door to keep watch. Therefore, keep watch because you do not know when the owner of the house will come back, whether in the evening or at midnight or when the rooster crows or at dawn. If he comes suddenly, do not let him find you sleeping. What I say to you, I say to everyone, watch. The written word of the Lord.
Yeah.
Be to God. So, in the Sundays marching up to this first Sunday of Advent, we've been hearing parables from Jesus about the coming day of the Lord. So hopefully our congregations are ready to kind of sit and wrestle with this text. It's not going to be a new message with them, that the day of the Lord brings these sort of dark shadows, destruction in some ways, the ending of one paradigm and the beginning of the other. However, there seems to always be a temptation for us who present these texts or read passages like this to hear Jesus say, be on guard and watch, as almost an invitation to try to predict, to try to assess when this day of the Lord will be coming. So, Jim, how do we really bring about a better understanding of kind of avoiding that temptation with what Jesus is really trying to get at here in this context?
I mean, I think first of which is just kind of pay attention to the language of the text here, because I think you're right. There is a temptation to try to, like, I guess or speculate even. But it's none of these things are. I say these all things. Nothing that Jesus says. I say all these things. Now go investigate it and figure it out. None of it is saying figure it out. It's all saying rather like wait, and not just wait, but wait actively.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, your text reads a little different than mine. I'm reading the NRSV right now, and all the places where it said watch in your reading, it literally says like keep awake, keep actively awake. So that was interesting.
I think I prefer that reading because
Mm-hmm.
when it says watch, there, at least in our modern context, watch has sort of a passivity to it. Like you're watching Netflix, or when you watch, or you're a spectator. You're not actively staying awake to see what things are happening.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, right? And that's like part of our consumer culture, I think, at least in the West. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
sure if we have overseas listeners or not, but especially like in the US, we consume things, and actually, like, we talk about the Bible and the Word of God as like food and something we consume actually
Mm-hmm.
often, which I don't think is always bad, but I think it can actually become something that we also consume, like we consume Netflix. Um, and you have all these podcasts actually and theorists online that speculate about what this means in this episode, so on and so forth. And so that might not help this kind of like icky temptation we have to try to guess the day of the Lord or whatever.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, but like, like I think we just have to remember that this is not something for us to consume. It's something for us to be a part of. The text, I truly believe, is our story, and so it's not something to stand back from and try to, I guess, get to the bottom of always.
Right.
It's something that we need to find ourselves in.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think are, to be faithful to this text, what is Jesus trying to get at in mentioning all of these sort of cataclysmic things that are happening? I mean, we're talking about the luminaries falling from the heavens. We see this sort of apocalyptic language taking place. And where are we supposed to perhaps see ourselves in what Jesus is trying to get at here?
Yeah, so it's hard, right? Because I guess first of all, Jesus's audience here is not our audience today. It's not your congregation, is what I'm trying to say. Most likely, Jesus' audience is an oppressed minority. Christianity in the U.S. is probably the most powerful and influential religion. So, in some ways, we really need to read. We need to ask ourselves, why is Jesus saying this? And we need to remember who he's speaking to. The reason I think he's saying these things is like the only way that these people who are so downtrodden can hope for anything is that there's this like apocalyptic inbreaking of God's love. That is not to say that I don't think God's love doesn't like disrupt and interrupt today in our own context in the U.S. I just think, and actually, I get to this. We can get to this probably farther along in the podcast. I think we have to like look for it more, and we can. Again, I don't want to fall into the language of consuming, but we can reap hope from our being attentive to the way God is working in the world.
And our at least Wesleyan understanding of prevenient grace can help us with that. If we're really if we really do believe what we say about prevenient grace, then we will be actively attentive to where the Holy Spirit is moving, where God is working, and want to participate with that, rather than try to, because all of these predictions that come up about when Christ returns, it has this really subversive message that says, this is when everything will end. When I feel like the Christian hope is, it's not the end of all things, but the redemption of all things.
Yeah.
So if we want our mode to equal our message here, then when we look and try to participate with God's inbreaking in the world, then we would be actively pursuing not the end of all things, but the redemption of all things. And how would that shape our lives and reading of texts like these when Jesus says such sort of apocalyptic things?
First of all, that's a great question, and I think people have been trying to answer those kind of questions for forever now, but I'll take a stab at it. What the heck? Yeah, I like what you were saying there about how God's inbreaking is about redemption, not like ending. Whenever this is one of the reasons that like death is so sad, is that it's, at least to the world, that like death is the end of all things, right? Like you don't, there's nothing after that. Although there are a lot of people who think there might be. It is at least an end to the way you related to that person that you knew. Or if you're the person who died, it's an end to the way you could relate with them.
Right.
So like I think, and just to add on to your language of redemption, I'd want to talk about newness too. Because I think it might even be a more helpful dyad, because like as opposed to looking for endings, we can look for beginnings. Like how is God making things new? How is God working in the world to make things new? And this goes back to your earlier question. I don't think that's by always these obvious cosmological like events. It's going to look very different in our political economy and in our particular context today.
Yeah. Well, and what you said about the audience being that oppressed minority, you have all of these systems of oppression ending in the passages preceding this. In Mark, you have the temple destroyed. You have even the very cosmological fabric where it feels like everything has become a tool of oppression to these people. And so you have the Savior speaking some very salvific language, and a caution on not to be so caught up on the end of these things that you miss the call to faithfulness in the midst of that. And I think our tendency, at least in modern evangelicalism in America, is that we often see ourselves as the oppressed. Like especially now, you hear so much political language about shaping ourselves, the evangelical as the minorities, almost, that because we're losing authority and sway in our culture, we almost see ourselves as the oppressed or persecuted, when that I think that's a misread of the times and of the call to faithfulness here. So at least to me, as a white American male, Christian, that I need to understand that it's not, I'm not the oppressed here. Perhaps I'm being called, just like in last week's text, to the least of these. I'm being called to see how I've participated in systems of oppression.
Yes.
And how my authority or my call is to be there for the least of these, not in my commitment to the systems, but my commitment to the vulnerable.
Yeah, I think that's really good. And I think so all of that was really helpful for me, and it made me think of, like, we need to ask the question of why are these things ending, right? Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
why is God ending these things? Why is Christ predicting the end of these things? Why do these things have to end? Um, and we got to, like, ask ourselves, like, what systems must end in our world today, in order that there's room for a newness that resembles the love and reign of God.
Yeah.
Um, and like you were saying, like, a lot of the times is like, man, I'm wrapped up in those systems, and I'm a piece of those systems. Um, and actually, I think there's a temptation there on, like, if we were talking earlier about kind of like removing yourself and trying to find, the hidden Da Vinci Code clues in the Bible or whatever.
Right.
There's the opposite, I think, more like, even liberal reaction, which says, well, I'm just going to not be a part of anything. And I can, remove myself from the world. And I don't think that works either. Like, I don't think that works. I think we have to accept, one, the blood on our hands. And I think that's the most important thing that white men and white people can do, especially in America at this time, is not to refuse that we're not racist, but to rather be confessional and say, I have participated in racist systems. I have participated in things that I wish weren't the way that they are, and I promise you, my Black brother, sister, queer person, that I will try to do my best to destroy those systems, yeah, so that newness can come. Yeah.
Yeah. It definitely seems that Christ is about um, talking about the end, but like we've said so many times, we're talking about the end of these things, but the why is so important, and the why needs to be shaping our call to faithfulness, not the end of them, right? It's always because sometimes, like when you're in Babylon for 70 years and Jeremiah says, behold, I know the plans that I have for you, right? It's in 70 years I will come and rescue you from the system of oppression. That's an entire generation of people. So we ourselves may not even be there for the end of these things, but our call is not for the end. Our call is to faithfulness.
Yeah.
So that we can even plant seeds now, so that the future generations can inherit the end of these systems of oppression.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
So, the jumping just from one difficult question to the next, how would we, how do we make open doors of invitation for our congregations to really understand the depth of what Christ is trying to get at here as we begin our Advent season together?
Well, I think I might just, like, draw us to the section of the text that I engage most fully in my commentary this week,
Mhm.
uh, and that's the necessity for watchfulness part, verses 32 through 37 of chapter 13. And I think for me, yeah, well, first of all, obviously Advent. There's this, like, necessity for watchfulness, this, like,
Right.
watching out for things. Um, but I think in there lies this idea that we are responsible for not just, like, I guess, being good Christians. Yeah,
Mhm.
let's say that we are responsible not just for being good Christians. And in fact, I think this act that I'm about to talk about is part of being a good Christian. But, like, we can't just be inward looking and think about how we are to, like, serve God most fully without looking outward.
Mhm.
Because when I was thirsty, you gave me drink. When you were hungry, you fed me.
Right.
When I was naked, you clothed me. So I think for me, that's why this last section drew me in so much, because, right, it's about this master leaving. First of all, actually, it starts with um, verse 32. But about that day or hour, no one knows, neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. So it's like kind of at the beginning of this like mini section is like, so don't worry about all that. Like, it's like, don't
Yeah.
worry about that. And then he goes on to say, um, be aware, keep alert, for you do not know when the time will come. It is like a man going on a journey when he leaves home and puts his slaves in charge, each with his work, and commands the doorkeeper to be on the watch. Um, and I think for me, I hear Jesus saying that if we are the slaves and if Jesus is the master in this parable, which I think he's getting at, then our job is to keep things not just like going, but to make the estate better, right? So it's not just like to like make sure everything stays as it is, but I really get the sense here that like Jesus is entrusting us, the Christian church, to not just take care of the estate, but make it better. And one of the ways we do that is we anticipate God's coming again, right?
Right.
So that is like, I guess teleologically speaking, like the end goal of a lot of Christianities, anyways, that Jesus will come again, and new creation will come, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't think that, again, like this language of Jesus coming, I think there's also an us going. I think there's an us building toward that. Because the kingdom is now and not yet, now and not yet. And so what are the ways that we can keep this estate going, and building it? Sorry, I said now and not yet. I mean, I meant to say, yeah, now and not yet. That's right. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, like how are we moving the kingdom forward, even though I'm sure there's a better word there than forward. How are we proliferating God's love? How about that?
Mm-hmm.
How are we making the estate bigger? And not in some colonial sense where we're conquering or converting, right? I want to be clear about that. But like in the sense of how is our estate affecting the world in a way that feeds the poor?
Mm-hmm.
Like we were talking earlier, dismantles racism.
Right.
These are things that I think we can all agree are bad, right?
Yeah.
Like it's not. So I think there's a lot of opinions on how to approach these problems, but I think if the starting point is these things are bad, and we agree that the gospel says we need to engage these things actively, right? As we keep alert, stay watching. Part of that keeping alert and staying watching is looking for God in the hungry and the poor and the oppressed. And so I guess that is how I would say you would start to get your congregants to start thinking that way, is just talk to them about that. Talk to them about that passionately. Honestly, like I feel, I'm very blessed. I go to Blakemore Church of the Nazarene. It's a wonderful church. But there are young people in those pews, and I know this is not the case in all Nazarene or even Wesleyan denominations, that hunger for these kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
And they want to make a difference, and they're not jaded yet. And they want to like be fiery for the Lord and in their own way, right? And so I think that's the difficulty, is like getting them excited and then also letting them in some ways go.
Right.
And do what does he say here? He leaves home and puts his slaves in charge, each with his work, or her work, we might say, and commands the doorkeeper to be on the watch. So we need to empower, I think, our congregations. One, we need to trust our congregations. Two, and I think, like I said earlier, just talking about this, like what this means, and it can take forms in a variety of ways, is like the very seeds of getting your congregation excited or interested, or looking for God in the world.
Yeah, it brings up a couple of things to mind of how we often think of work. We have such a negative connotation about work, and so many of the people, at least in my pews, are just so busy, and so when you already have a picture of spirituality as a place of comfort and not necessarily apathy, but just to just be, that we kind of have this notion of Christianity that I just want to come and be and just stop for a while, which is good. I mean, we're called to Sabbath, we're called to rest and not be defined by our work. But this labor that Christ is calling us to is more about the purpose of our labors. So
Hmm.
if we can step back from all the things that we do and understand how it works in systems of oppression, or how it, if we can look at these things that we work at every day of our life through the eyes of the most vulnerable
Hmm.
in our culture, that is where I think Christ is really calling us to see our labor, not add on more, but to reorient our philosophy of work, to
Yeah.
really approach it through the lens of the least of these, and then say that we're not called. If we think everything's going to end, we will be passive. But if we think if we truly believe that God's going to redeem all things, then that should call us to participation in how God is redeeming, starting that work here and now for the thing that's not yet come. Like we're being involved in that not yet kingdom. I really like those paradigms you shaped.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, no, I think that's really good, and I think that hmm, you know what? I think that's yeah. I don't think I can say or add anything. That was I think you covered it right then.
Well, thanks for paving the way.
Yeah, no, no, yeah. Well, sometimes it's like actually maybe this is a lesson too. Sometimes as the pastor, you need to make space for you know and I know like I'm not your pastor or you're not my pastor, but like like sometimes it's like, yeah, they just said that really well, and I'm just gonna let them do that. Like yeah,
One of the ways that I've been stewing over this text is if I am the best person to preach it.
mm,
And I'm thankful to have a sister in ministry as my associate pastor, and so I've asked her to bring this message to the
mm,
congregation to start off the season of Advent in a way, and it just kind of made me think just now that perhaps it's best to have this message come from um, someone who understands what it's like to be seen not for who they really are. With
yeah,
all of the things that have been happening in our culture towards women,
yeah,
uh, it's I think it's so important to have these things shaped by that very um, real struggle or tendency of having perspectives so shaped by systems of oppression that we can't even see our sisters for who they really are,
right,
that we
yeah,
can't see them truthfully in the lens of Christ. So I'm hoping that can be a participation with the Spirit and saying that she's leading the day. Like she needs to, not only is she leading the day, but she needs to be heard in that leadership for that way. So perhaps that might be a, a good homiletical handle in itself.
yeah. No, I think that's great, and I think I mean something I point to in my commentary as well is just like um, I guess first just thank you for being attentive to those dynamics. And I think that's what I want to point to in my commentary too is part of building this estate, keeping it healthy, keeping it proliferating in a way that spreads love and not domination is being consistently on watch for these kind of opportunities, right? And consistently it's hard, right? Because, and I know pastors, I'm not a pastor myself, confession, but my stepdad is, and it's hard on pastors. It's hard on pastors' families too, um, because you are held in this kind of inhuman, kind of sacrosanct light by your congregation or by your denomination, for that matter. And I just want to say first, I don't think that's fair to all the pastors listening, and I'm sorry that happens. And I try as much as I can to treat pastors like people because they hardly get treated like people.
Yeah.
Um, and so I know like their position is extremely hard. That's all I want to say there. But to be a consistent voice, to be consistently looking for these ways of making the text come through more powerfully, or looking for the right person to deliver this text, like you were saying, Ben. I think that is what the watchfulness is here. I tell a story in my commentary about one of my friends who went to Yale Divinity School, and he just happened to go to church one Sunday while he's on a business trip. My friend, he hadn't gone to church in, I think, 4 or 5 years. Um, he just had a very abusive experience with church. And so he just said, actually, I really like, because we've talked about it, right? He understands his relationship with church to be like, I have to create some space between me and it before I can go back, because all I can do right now is associated with abuse. So I think that's actually a mature and thoughtful way to think about it, and I appreciate him thinking that way. But when he went on this business trip just a few months ago, it was right when the Charleston white supremacist marches were happening, and he went to Episcopal church, so Wesleyans were not thrown out of the boat on this one. And Episcopalians are great. I have nothing against them either. But he went to Episcopal church, and he said the text that Sunday was just one of the most political texts, I can't recall which one it was, that he's ever read. And then the speaker failed to engage it as such. Instead, they kind of like what you said, Ben, by people don't always want to come and be challenged in church, and I don't think they should always be challenged, but there are certain times where I think it's important that you take a stand. And there's certain contexts and events that should make those times where you need to stand up and take that kind of forgive this term, but social revenue,
right,
or trust even that you've built with your congregation, and challenge them. And for Paul, my friend, this was one of those times. That priest should have said something, and he didn't say anything because he just wanted to not rock the boat or whatever. And I was thinking about this, right? I was thinking about this as you were talking about it, like this congregants not wanting to be challenged or pushed too hard, or feel safe. And I think that's so important. But I guess I want to ask you, in some ways, how do you find that balance? One, because I think that this is why I'm not a pastor, right? I think that's so hard to do. And I don't know, it terrifies me to even kind of put myself in a pastoral spot. So I guess I'm asking you a question back. How do you do that?
Yeah, that's a question I constantly ask myself. I think what I've found most powerful in my path of past mistakes of trying to do that faithfully is making sure that there's room for lament in our gatherings. Because if we have a whole host of different perspectives and political allegiances in a given congregation, but if we're not able to lament faithfully together about these atrocities in the world and call evil for what it is, then I'm not sure that we can worship faithfully.
Right.
So that's been at least my go-to, is to, not, perhaps it will be addressed in the sermon, but during the time of prayer, which I hope is a part of every worship gathering, is that we take time to pray prayers of lament, like the psalmist, and say, our heart breaks over the hatred, the racism, the abuses of others in this world. And if we don't take time for that and let texts like these shape those moments for us, then I don't feel like we're staying awake. We're not awake to what's going on.
Yeah, it's funny. It's kind of like, I know I'm Nazarene, confession, and so for instance, my denomination has a stance against alcohol for a lot of great reasons, I think. But when you use religion to kind of just be satiated and just to be comforting, at some point you're using religion like alcoholics use alcohol. Like, you know, and I know this is like a stretch. This is a stretch analogy, but it's real, right? I mean, if your religion is making you warm and fuzzy all the time and you can just kind of zone out, I think that's a real problem. I think anytime it's alienating you from others, um, then that's a problem. So no, I really like your answer there about the lament and the communal prayer. Yeah, Blakemore does that too, and I really those are some of my favorite times in our services. Is the liturgist will say a prayer, a lament in some cases, like you were mentioning, and then there'll be a time for whomever within the body to echo a more specific prayer.
Mm. Oh, I like that a lot.
Mm-hmm.
That'd definitely be something to incorporate in the future. Because I love any opportunity to where we can speak both communally and individually. So if we're giving that opportunity to lament individually, that's really powerful too. Well, a lot of great things here, Jim. If those of you who are listening, if you have not yet read Jim's commentary on this passage, please do so. And we have a lot of other great commentators this week if you're not preaching from the gospel passage. But before we end our time together, Jim, is there any final word you'd like to give over this coming week?
Yeah, I think. Sorry, I realized I started telling that story about my friend. I don't think I ever finished it. I did get to the part where the priest, you know, he didn't do the text justice. He didn't do his congregation
Right.
justice. And so, you know, Paul was kind of giving church a chance again, because I think that people, especially now, are really looking for a consistent and responsible religious moral voice. But he didn't find that there. And I think for him that was more like a more affirmation of him not being ready for church yet, or church not being ready for him, like, you know. And so, yeah, I just think I really encourage just anyone who has any kind of position, Sunday school teachers, what have you, just be there for your congregants and don't sell them short. And yeah, I guess that's my prayer for all the pastors listening to this, and myself, and anyone who has any kind of leadership in the church, in our context today.
Yeah. Well, thanks again. It's been a real pleasure having this conversation. Those of you who have tuned in, please subscribe to the YouTube, to Twitter, all those other fancy social media outlets that we have too. We have a newsletter that goes out every week that keeps you up to date on the most recent commentaries. We do have a whole backlog of year A. If you happen to be preaching from a different text this week, check those out. But as I said at the beginning, keep watch, not only with what Jesus is asking us here, but keep watch on updates for Plain Account as well. And we're excited to see what the Lord's going to do through this resource. One of the things we didn't even mention in that Jim said in his commentary, which I think is so vital and contextually savvy, is to stay woke. And it's a kind of a interesting colloquialism for today, and I think it's so fitting about how it's an active staying awake and keeping watch, so that you're aware. I had an old pastor tell me once, and I've never forgotten it, a good pastor will keep the scriptures in one hand and the newspaper in the other. So understanding that these words are life-giving today, and how we preach them will shape that for the people who are listening. It's a scary responsibility, but it's a responsibility nonetheless. So in your preaching this week, stay woke, and the peace of Christ be with you all. Thanks for joining us.